be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see. So I will fight if you'll fight. Yeah, I will fight, but only if you'll fight. Oh, we can make it through this like sailors in a tempest. Like sailors in a tempest together. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our Lung Cancer Living Room live from Atlanta. I am super excited to have everybody here. For those who don't know me, I'm Jennifer King. I'm the Senior Director of Science and Research for GO2 Foundation for Lung Cancer. So I'm going to start with what seems like a simple question, but can be fairly difficult as you dive in. And I'll start with Dr. Romalingam, but I'd like all of you to weigh in, which is, what is a biomarker? What is biomarker testing? And how do you describe it to the patients who come in?
Sure. So biomarker is some biological information from an individual that predicts something else about how that individual's course is going to be. It could be that if you have the mutation, you're going to respond to this therapy. So the mutation there is a biomarker. There are markers that tell you if you have this marker, you're probably going to live longer. That's also a biomarker. And then there are markers that are used in certain instances to say whether a particular treatment will be tolerable or will be more toxic to that particular individual. So we can use this information for a number of things. In the sense we're talking here in lung cancer, we refer to biomarkers primarily to help us understand what therapies are going to work for the given patient sitting in front of us. About 15 years ago, when we took care of lung cancer patients, every patient got the same treatment. If they had stage 4, everybody got the same platinum-based chemotherapy. When that stopped working, they went on to get another chemotherapy. We didn't know why some patients, even with chemotherapy, did really well, and some did not do very well. Now we have the sophisticated information to take a given patient's tumor or their blood, conduct tests, and understand what specific treatments are the most likely to work for them. Not only that, after we have a patient on treatment, at some point, if resistance develops to therapies, we can go back to the biomarker testing and understand why the tumor developed resistance and think about what might overcome that resistance so the patients can go on into the next inning of their lung cancer fight. So a biomarker can be used in many terms to define something, but what we're talking about here is to take some biological information from a given patient to help us decide what treatments work best for them.
And that's not a single test, right? In a lot of cases, would you like to speak to, or maybe Dr. Hill to start, what different types of tests go into what we talk about as just biomarker testing?
And that's a great point, because from the pathology side, we would like to think, and I would argue that we have been doing biomarker testing for decades, for almost 100 years, because we've used antibodies, immunohistochemistry, where we take a monoclonal antibody to a specific protein, and we can detect protein, we can quantify it in a specific tumor cell, and we do that on glass slides. But that's protein testing. But and that is a variety of biomarker. We also do molecular genetic testing, and so the genetic profiling of the tumor, there are a variety of mechanisms, tests that we can do for that, whether it's very, very specific. I heard KRAS G12D. We have tests that test is specifically for that. Is there a mutation of the codon G12 of KRAS? So single gene, single marker testing. But then we now have expanded out to multi-gene, multi-marker testing, and that now has provided very large amounts of information, and it can be very clinically helpful, but at the same time, managing all of that information, how do we go back and reanalyze that data as new drugs come out, is something that's an interesting question that we all struggle with today. But we've got some of that biomarker information. We just like to be able to remine that data periodically.
So an example of the protein-based testing you talked about would be PD-L1, which we heard
Absolutely.
someone talk about today. Right now there's a lot of questions, I think. What are the current guidelines on who should be tested and for what? If you're a patient with, let's start with stage 4. Stage 4 lung cancer, possibly non-small cell, but you can all comment on that. What should you be asking for if you come in and you want to have biomarker testing? Open to anyone on the panel.
Yeah, I would say that for anyone diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer now, biomarker testing is a must before you start somebody's treatment journey. Now we look at lung cancer broadly, as you're already aware of, squamous cell, adenocarcinoma, and small cell. In small cell lung cancer, we're still trying to figure out what biomarkers are helpful in predicting. So I would leave that for now and talk more about adenocarcinoma and squamous. In adenocarcinoma, the biomarker testing should include looking for the various genes, mutations, fusions. ALK is a fusion, EGFR is a mutation. Those are just different ways by which the changes in the DNA sequence affect the biology of the tumor. So we have about 5 targets in lung non-squamous tumors that have FDA-approved therapies. EGFR is one, ALK is another, ROS1 is another target, BRAF mutations, and finally NTRK mutations. Now there are a few other targets for which there are some very promising treatments that are not too far from being FDA approved. Examples would be RET mutation fusions and MET fusions. And then there's other promising therapies. KRAS G12C is one where we have some exciting developments in the clinic. So as you start adding up the number of markers that you need before you will have good information on what treatment is going to work for the individual, it's just an expanding list. So the next generation sequencing approaches are now the most commonly used in the clinic. What that means is you're looking for all of these markers at the same time with one test, as opposed to looking for, okay, I'm going to look for EGFR. Well, there's no EGFR. Okay, let me look for ALK. There's no ALK. Now let me look for KRAS. So that was a sequential testing approach that was initially used. Now the wider platform, do one test. You have limited amount of tissue. Often you don't have a lot of tissue to do one test, go to B, to C, to D. So you do one test and you get all the information. The other key piece of information is the PD-L1 expression now that we are using to decide if immunotherapy would work for a patient. For squamous cell lung cancer, we would want the PD-L1 testing before we make treatment decisions. For patients who don't have the mutations with adenocarcinoma that we can target, we would want their PD-L1 expression level as well to guide immunotherapy treatment approaches. So these are the markers we use in clinic. This is obviously a list that's expanding as we speak from month to month, if not year to year. And this is helping us personalize therapy for our patients.
I think it's a great question and something that we struggle with every day. For instance, we've started sequencing at Emory in about February of 2014. And initially, we started with a relatively small panel of genes. Now, back to high school biology, everybody in the room probably learned that there are about 30 to 35,000 genes. That actually is no longer correct. There really probably are only between 15 and 17,000 genes that are relevant. A lot of DNA just kind of holds the rest of the DNA together, although there's argument that it may be regulatory and there are other things that could be going on. The reason I bring this up is deciding how big of a cancer panel to do is a real challenge. We don't need all 15,000 genes because a lot of those genes have nothing to do with cancer. And therefore, we have to carve out subsets that we think are relevant. But it's a moving target, and more information is usually better, and therefore we like to do as many as we can when it comes to the sequencing data. Inevitably, we run across things that we don't know what mean. It may be the right gene, for instance, EGFR. We may find an EGFR mutation, but it may be what we would call a private mutation, that hasn't been described in cancer patients on a regular basis. And these variants of uncertain significance are things that we have to run across and have conversations about what we think this might be doing. And with more research and with more analysis, I think we're going to get to the bottom of that. But it's a very different world today than it was just since 2014, because the panel we were doing then, which was relatively small, is not adequate today. And it also now, with some of the newest drugs, and particularly when we talk about immunotherapy, I think what you're going to see is some of these DNA-based panels get even larger because of a concept called tumor mutational burden, where the immunotherapy, we believe, is going to work better when you accumulate these mutations in your genes, and your proteins then produce novel markers that your immune system can actually attack. And so tumor mutational burden requires then to accurately measure, we have to get a certain number of millions of bases of DNA sequenced to really get an accurate number. So as a result of that, you're seeing gene panels from Foundation 1 that's in excess of 300 genes. Caris and others are in the 300 to 500 gene range. I have a colleague at the University of Chicago who has a 1,200 gene panel. And so we don't know the right number today, but we know it's bigger than what most of us do on a regular basis.
That's great. And just with that, I want to go back. We've been talking a lot about stage 4 and recommendations there, where there's a lot of tests out there. But as we said, we have a multidisciplinary team. I want to hear from our other panel members. We'll start with surgery, and then we'll move to radiation. But when you're thinking about biomarker testing in a patient who's going to undergo surgery, which in some cases could be looking to be curative, what do you recommend? Do you recommend biomarker testing? Do you use their surgical sample? Do you test ahead of time? What does the recommendations look like for the different surgical cases?
Yes, it's an interesting question. So, right now we don't tailor the way we do an operation based off of a biomarker, because the biomarker is looking at more at how someone's going to respond to a drug, not necessarily a surgery at this time. There are studies that are looking at whether giving some of these drugs before surgery for these patients who we right now think are curative is going to be beneficial. And I put the word curative in quotes because, yes, we do a great job with surgery for patients with stage 1 and stage 2 lung cancer, and we can potentially cure them. But what we do know is that a very high percentage of people after surgery will recur. It's higher in lung cancer than it is in most other cancers at early stages. And so there are ongoing studies looking at whether these drugs can help someone before surgery to reduce the tumor burden so that we can go in surgically and then remove what's left and reduce their recurrence rates. Those studies are ongoing. And so at the moment, there is not much of a role for biomarkers before surgery. That being said, after surgery is where the biomarkers become very, very important. So it's very useful to, after we've removed the surgical specimen, to do these biomarker testing, because we can profile a patient's tumor, and whether or not they need the therapies, it can still provide beneficial information, because if that patient then a year or two down the road, their cancer comes back, we have now we have these profiling biomarkers done beforehand. And so if it comes back in some place where it's difficult to get adequate amounts of tissue to do all this testing, there's plenty of tissue available for surgery. So, we routinely send all of our surgical specimens for biomarker testing, whether or not someone's going to need biomarkers afterwards, because you never know what's going to happen 2-3 years down the road.
Great, thanks. And what about radiation oncology? How are you incorporating any thoughts of biomarkers into that area?
Yeah, well, one thing I would say is a lot of times we do rely on surgery to get sufficient tissue. A lot of times when we're treating with radiation, we might not be able to get the right amount of tissue. With that said, so radiation is typically used for all stages of lung cancer, and often we are kind of the most important part of stage 3 lung cancer, which is still in this quote curable category. Right now, the 5-year survival, most recent studies show about 30% are still alive at 5 years. This is before conventional targeted therapy, so maybe it's even higher now. So how do I use it? Well, if that information is available to me, it gives me a really nice roadmap. I'm very excited about biomarkers because when I look at just adenocarcinoma or squamous, you put 10 patients in front of you, you give them all the same treatment, they're not all going to have the same outcomes. So you're really blindly guessing. And I worry that sometimes physicians, if they're cognitively depleted at the end of the day, they may not want to go the extra mile for a patient because they lump everyone into the average. And we know that no one's the average, especially today with biomarker testing. So now if I have a patient who's an EGFR positive patient, I'm very careful with what we're doing. I'm looking long term at this person. And unfortunately, if I have a patient who just has no mutations at all, we may adapt how aggressive we might be, kind of prioritize quality of life over aggressiveness of treatment. But with that said, it's really when it comes to tailoring radiation therapy, so many decisions go on. How are you going to design the treatments? Whether you're going to add aggressive chemotherapy at the same time, how much dose you want to give. And we have lots of factors to try to predict how a patient may tolerate that treatment or how long they may live. But today, at least, we have a much better projection of knowing what their long-term survival might be. And also, as radiation oncologists, we can buy liaisons to get the patient back to their medical oncologist as quickly as possible for additional therapies. Because they're really in the trenches with us for a very long time. We talk to them every single week while they're undergoing the radiation. That provides us with a time for counseling and education so that they're prepared for that next journey in their trajectory.
And one other thing that I'll add is that there, regardless of the local therapy, whether it be surgery or radiation, there are, even for stage 1, stage 2 cancers where there's not a lot of evidence we don't know whether these targeted therapies will help after surgery. There are several ongoing clinical trials looking at people who have had a local therapy and they have their tumors are positive for a biomarker, and giving them targeted therapies after their local therapy, and then kind of seeing if there's going to be a benefit from this. And these studies are ongoing. Some of them have actually completed enrollment, and we should have results soon. But I think in 5 years we may find that if you have an EGFR mutation and you have stage 1 lung cancer and you have an EGFR mutation and you have surgery, there may be benefit to taking these therapies afterwards. When before we found giving patients such as that chemotherapy really was not very beneficial. But so I think it's important that whatever local therapy you have, that you be tested for biomarkers.
Thanks. I think that's great. And our biggest thank you of all to our panel for joining us tonight, and to all of the patients and caregivers who are in the audience who were able to make
Oh, I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see. So I will fight if you'll fight. Yeah, I will fight, but only if you'll fight. Oh, we can make it through this like sailors in a tempest. Like sailors in a tempest together. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.